So today we'll have 3 talks, hopefully. We'll start with a panel with Maria PAWLOWSKA and Jen Garrett on how to build a local quantum ecosystem and build bridges locally, internationally. Then we'll have a keynote from Professor Michele MOSCA. And last, Itamar SIVAN from Quantum Machines will present his view on quantum orchestration. But before, I'd like to remind you some ground rules for the webinar. First, as attendees, of course, you can't broadcast your videos. If you want to ask questions, best thing to do is to use the Q&A. So there is a specific Q&A window that you can use. And the best thing is, yeah, of course, use it, ask questions. We'll try always to keep 5 minutes to answer your question during the session, but the panelists and the speakers will be able to answer the question after their session if we can't answer all of your questions. And now we'll start with a panel with Maria and Jane. And I'll stop sharing my screen so that we can have a better view on Maria and Jen. Maria, Jen, thanks very much for joining us today. I'm very happy and very honored to host this panel with you. Again, if you, dear attendees, if you have questions, don't hesitate to use the Q&A. We'll try to keep 5 to 10 minutes in order to take the question and answer them during the panel. But now I will try to shut up and let Maria and Jen introduce themselves. Can you please, yeah, in 5 minutes each, introduce yourself and your organization? And I think what would be very interesting also is to stress your local specificities so that we can understand how, given a certain set of constraints, you succeeded in creating an ecosystem. Maybe Maria, you'd like to start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. I'd just like to begin by thanking you for the invitation. This is a great opportunity. It's really nice to be here. Hello to everyone watching as well. And as a brief introduction, I'm the Director for International Relations at Visnea, and we're a company that's at the interface of academia and business. And we specialize in working with researchers and R&D departments and really making sure we tailor our services every time to the needs of our clients. Who include both, academics working at universities and businesses. I think the important thing to stress is that most of the people we employ are actually scientists. So when we speak to, for example, quantum physicists, we actually literally speak their language and know their circumstances and the environment in which we operate. Our head of R&D is actually a physicist herself, so she can really speak the language to a greater extent than perhaps most people in the game when it comes to companies and businesses. And what we specialize in is making sure that when we speak to people, we know what they want and what they need. For example, in quantum, there is a lot of interest in space and a lot of interest in defense. So we make sure that the staff we work with, the staff that is actually working on these projects has all the required security clearances. That's actually a big deal when it comes to that. We also make sure that the people we work with actually know about space and about space technologies and have worked with both the European Space Agency and the European Defense Agency and keep a close eye on the quantum calls and the quantum priorities there. And I think as an organization, what we really try to do is make ourselves useful to the people we work with and to know both the needs of the scientists, which are very different to the needs of the R&D departments and companies that we work with, and making sure that we can connect these people, sometimes just act as a translator in some circumstances and make sure that they understand one another and are able to collaborate in the most effective way for everyone involved. But also when it comes to scientists taking their inventions and wanting to actually commercialize, particularly quantum ideas, that is sometimes tricky. And we make sure that we have the right people on board to work with the people that, well, with our clients, the scientists. And I think for us, the key in building the ecosystem, maybe this is not gonna sound like high-tech science, but is knowing everyone who's involved in this, knowing all the right people, making sure we have the connections both inside of Poland. We're based in Poland. I probably should have added that. but also in Europe in general and the US. And a very important thing for us has been IP and IPR protection of intellectual property and knowing the specifics in both the academic setting and the business setting, the European setting versus the American setting. I think the key has been having both the knowledge base and the contact base to be able to make the connections in a useful way. Thank you. I'm happy to pass over to Jane. I don't want to, I could go on and on and on, so I'll make sure to not do that and pass on to Jane.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. Oh, thanks, Maria. I'm terrible at going on myself, so I'm going to try and keep this succinct. I'm Jane Garrett, and I'm the Director of Enterprise for the Quantum Technology Enterprise Centre at the University of Bristol. Please note the word enterprise. I'm not the technical part of QTEC. QTEC is a government-backed project. We're basically part of the UK's national funding programme. We are the commercialisation arm of the research initiatives that have been funded in the hubs. There's 4 hubs been set up across the UK for an aspect of quantum. We are the commercialisation vehicle, and we're funded for 4 years in order to take quantum out of academia and into the marketplace. So we take through approximately 10 fellows per year through as a year-long programme, and they are funded to basically go through business level training. We don't let them go back to the lab. Essentially, they are going to be commercialising the research that they've been working on, either at PhD or in postdoc, the majority of them at postdoc level. And it's our objective to turn them from being a postdoc to be the CTO or the CEO of their startup businesses. So the objective at the end of the programme is to talk to the capital community and make sure that they're in funded startups by the time they actually leave us. Now, we've actually been very successful. I do like to say how well we've done. We've had, and I'm very bad at remembering numbers, but essentially the cohorts that we've had coming through, we're in our final year. We've got 13 of them this year. That's way too many. 13 academics running around trying to become the CXOs. It's hard work. But we've raised 17 million in equity, grant and revenue out of 13 businesses, and there have been 25 spin-outs so far. So the final cohort are in development. We are obviously hoping for those numbers to increase. And one thing that we do like to say is only one have we lost back to academia. The rest have gone into industry if they realise that entrepreneurship is not for them. Now, we built this from scratch. We are part of the University of Bristol. Our funding will end on the 31st of March next year. We have set up a programme. It's basically practitioner-led entrepreneurship training. And then it's all focused on the fellows on the programme have to do and implement that training. And we guide them. There's a team of 4 of us internally. We go through, as Maria said, the IP issues, and the university there is, we deal with universities across the globe. Majority come from the UK, so we're not purely Bristol-centric. And that proves challenging when we're dealing with technology transfer. The funding is also challenging, but key to actually helping these people to leave in funded businesses is finding the people that can help and guide them. And that network is absolutely vital. And we've reached across the globe to get the right people to come in and help these startups. So that's essentially how we've worked. We've had to try and find investments from venture capitalists. That's a growing industry, those that are looking to invest in quantum. Locally, the Bristol community is very much business focused. It's not educated money. And Maria and I were talking before we started this presentation, and she has come from Cambridge. I spent 21 years in Cambridge, and I watched the development of that ecosystem. And the benefit there is having educated money. It's having people that have built science-based businesses, been successful, and they've got skills and expertise to come back and immerse themselves into those that are going through that journey. And rather than go on, I will stop there. And
no, it's very interesting. I was about to ask you, Jane, and maybe Maria could elaborate after that. So as you came from Cambridge to Bristol, I would like to go, the first question I'd like to ask you is about what it takes to build a quantum ecosystem locally, and especially how to find and define a value proposition that matches other existing services, because there are probably other incubators, business partners, some VCs, some business angels that want to help, and how to find the right place and the right services to offer to the ecosystem so as to build value on top of what is already existing, and not fight against the local ecosystem, which wouldn't be the best thing to do when starting something new.
Yes, now, in Bristol, when I first arrived, because I was 21 years in Cambridge, I did my startup, I got the scars, I tell everybody, I took it through to an AIM float, and so I've done the entrepreneurial bit. I've built a network of people within Cambridge that I've reached out to help the QTEC businesses, because they are people that understand how you take deep science into the commercial world, and indeed the same investors that are based in Cambridge. Bristol does have a developing ecosystem. The incubator and accelerator that is set up to spin out from Bristol University is called Set Squared. They tend to operate at a later part of the development of the business. We are very much, let's take the academic out of the university, let's make them into the CTO, CEO. And then we feel very much that we will feed into the Set Squared incubator. They have a different perception of what they do, and we do have a little bit of a fight, but let's not go into that one now. But that's how we see ourselves in the ecosystem. Bristol's developing. There's a great incubator called Unit DX, where we were based, that's now set up. And we do try to integrate into the ecosystem, but Bristol's not renowned for deep science in the same way that Cambridge is. And that's where we've had to be a little bit creative in what we do in order to achieve the results we have.
Thanks. And Maria, how was it in Poland?
I think in our case, obviously, I mean, the quantum ecosystem in Poland is, I think, in some ways a little younger, quite frankly, especially with regards to commercializing the results. We've had the Horodecki family doing their amazing quantum physics up north, but not a lot of that has been commercialized, and definitely not inside of Poland. What's happened over the past few years is something really amazing, and these are literally the past 3 years. We've had 3 new international quantum institutes set up, 2 in Warsaw and 1 in Gdańsk. And I've had the incredible pleasure of working with 2 of them very closely as they were being set up. And they're both set up, one is the Institute of Quantum Optical Technologies in Warsaw is set up in association with actually Oxford University. And we've got the International Center for the Theory of Quantum Technologies, ICTQT, which is what I usually call it, up in Gdańsk, which has been set up with ICOKI in Vienna. And another center in Warsaw that is just being created in quantum computing, literally as we speak. So these are all very new, and I was basically there. I had the incredible pleasure of being there for the ecosystem, the academic ecosystem being created, and we are now working with the scientists there and the scientists who work with these institutes in trying to get the work they're doing commercialized. There's very little happening outside of that, and we do have, Jane mentioned, I couldn't help but smile, issues of IP, issues of technology transfer, issues of negotiating with universities. Every country in Europe still has a different legal system, even though we all have the one European patent system, fortunately, which we can all go for, and which is the aim for the people we work with. If you have a really good idea, you want a European patent on it, at the very least. But I think the real trick has been with regards to making sure the scientists, the really incredible scientists we work with, can communicate effectively with business, is they have very different skill sets. Sometimes I must have mentioned this before, and I probably will keep saying this, but they literally speak different languages. I mean, they will say the same words and they will mean two completely different things. And a big part of, making sure that this all works is making sure people can actually talk to each other, understand each other, and meet on the same page, so to speak. That a director for R&D in a big company, when they say commercialize, they probably mean something completely different than a scientist who's been mostly working on their computer for the past 2 years and has a wonderful idea and is very excited about it, that hasn't considered actual IP protection for literally a second. So our job has been, a lot of it has been working with, and it's a great privilege, I can't stress this enough, with really incredible minds doing the actual quantum physics and working with them to get their quantum physics into real life products and into companies.
I pick up on that briefly, but the language is so critical, because that's one of the very first things we do, is to create business speak within the academic and make them understand commercial terms. And I have an example of only 2 days ago when somebody was going in to do a negotiation with a very large organization. They had no commercial mindset. They were actually going to do the work for nothing. And that's a big step that you have to get through in the commercialization process.
I was speaking to scientists who a company wanted to pay them something, and they were like, oh, but if they only pay us X, it's not really worth our time. We were actually negotiating the deal with the company. The company didn't even consider paying them less than 100X, literally. That's how off the scale they were. And I keep explaining to them, you guys are the best mind in the business. You're not digging a ditch and being paid per pound of dirt. They can't go anywhere else. There's no one as smart as you in this country. It's got to be you. You get to name your price. So that is interesting. Another thing that we particularly see is, people get excited about space and defense, or they get really scared of space and defense. And we've had people telling us, oh no, the military might get interested in this. And then what do? We can't actually patent it if the military gets interested. I'm like, yes, but there's a lot of other things you can do if the military gets interested, and we can talk about that. So it's really just also making sure that people know what the options are, because sometimes, for example, scientists don't know, and it's absolutely not their fault. It's not their job to know. So it's kind of our job to create the conditions in which they get to know what they need to know to be most effective.
There is a question from the audience that I'd like to take now, because it's quite interesting and resonates with what you just said. It's about helping scientists and academics going toward entrepreneurship. And the question is, don't you think that it will cause a deceleration in scientific development, as there will be less people in the labs doing exploratory work and more on higher TRL? And we know that if we want to have great startups, especially in quantum world, we need robust science. So what's your point of view on scientists turning entrepreneurs and training a large number of scientists going towards entrepreneurship?
Shall I start? We found initially, 2016, when we started, we found it really hard to recruit. So we were due to take 10 people per year. We managed to get 4. So the quantum scientists at the time were actually not looking at commercialization as being an option. Now, I've never been an academic in my life. I've done a degree and a degree in physics, but that was the end of my academic career. But I understand that the academic world is very competitive, that there's a lot of applications for very few posts. So I think commercialization actually provides an option, a different route that they can take to basically have opportunity to build a business, as well as then there being the opportunity for staying in academia. And it was said actually at a meeting just before Christmas, when we've actually attracted quite a few of the Bristol people to come into QTEC and move away from KET labs. And the comment was, well, we've now got these places for our research scientists because you keep taking them into startups. But I think what we're doing is just creating a different channel. And I don't know if I've not done any numbers, or I've not seen any numbers to know whether there are vacancies in sort of the quantum postdoc world and they're not able to be filled. I mean, Maria might know more than I do in that respect.
I think good people are, good people will always find a good job. That's the hope. But what we see is that there are plenty of PhD students, plenty of very smart PhD students, and the number of academic jobs is not growing exponentially. And sometimes I feel that that's, the rate of growth when it comes to PhD students. And my point of view is I think of these people, these very young people who feel like if they don't get a postdoc or don't get a full-time academic position, their life is a failure. And, mental health and all sorts of other stuff comes into play. And when in fact, I think if they were shown at the very beginning that you can do also there's this other option. You're not a failure if you don't become a professor. And there's so many of you, it's not possible for all of you to become professors. We don't have enough, institutes, and we don't have enough universities probably for that. And I don't think it's a failure. I think it's this whole, obviously it's not, it's this whole other adventure you can have, and you don't have to keep publishing papers. There's this other world and other things to achieve. And I'm with you, Jane, on this. I really don't think this is a problem. And I think people, at the end, it's, people are making a decision. You're not holding them at gunpoint. They can go back to academia if they want to. They don't want to. Hopefully they'll have happier, more fulfilling lives, or I don't know, make more money at least, and then get to spend that and have more fulfilling lives. But I really think it's a good thing to show people that there are other things they can do with their lives, and that even being a quantum physicist, which I think 15 years ago, we all thought if you're a quantum physicist, you're just about as applied as an astrophysicist. There's like two places you can work, and they're both academic centers. I think this is changing very rapidly, and it's an exciting time to be a quantum physicist, even if you don't want to stay at a university. And I think that's important to stress.
The other thing that we do is if they don't make it in terms of the entrepreneurial world and the startup world, they're then better equipped for industry. So we're providing another level of training, and it's working.
There's one thing I would like to have a bit more feedback is because you both mentioned that when you started your initiative, you had to cope with universities and how to get access to IP. So it was a lot, I imagine it was a lot of work helping scientists get access to the IP. So the question will be a bit broader. It's about how to convince and align the key partners, and who are those key partners to look for in the quantum ecosystem, so that you can have more startups, and you lower the barrier to entry to create new companies.
Jane, you wanna?
Yeah. Sure, I'm happy to start. I mean, so the access to the intellectual property, that generally has come with the academic that comes onto the program. So it's something that they've worked on in their own research. But naturally, it's owned by an academic institution. And we have to go through sometimes a very painful process of extracting the right to freedom to operate. Different universities have different IP policies. Bristol, when I first joined, it's related to the amount of equity that the university wants to take in the startup, which often precludes a venture capitalist coming in, realizing there's enough equity left in that startup to incentivize the founding team. As an example, when I joined, Bristol had a policy of taking 66%. I'm telling you what I was told. In fact, by Chris Irvin of KETS, who's one of our spin-out businesses. And I nearly fell over. I could not believe that was the university's policy. It's changed now. But because we take in people from different universities across the world and the UK, we have other examples of there being a very greedy policy by the university, which will prevent that business receiving capital. There has been a recent example where the business fought, or the person fought for about a year to take that IP at a reasonable amount of equity. They ended up having to hire a CEO, and at that point, the university backed down and offered a reasonable equity portion that they wanted to take. So I don't know the resolution to that. It sounds like it's a problem across Europe. I believe the States has better policies. So Cambridge, I believe, in the UK has a better view of the tech transfer than other universities. So that's on the IP side. Maria, do you want to come in on that first, and then?
Yeah, maybe I would, because actually this is our everyday job, so to speak. This is a lot of what we do. And there's the first thought, it sounds obvious, but don't sign things that you are handed by your HR team at the university. That's been the one thing we keep repeating to the scientists we work with, because sometimes it's weeks into negotiating business deals with them that we find out there's all this other paperwork that they've signed because, you know, someone handed it to me, so I signed. Please don't do that. Please, if we're talking about IP, if we're talking about licenses, don't sign anything without a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. That's my second point. Again, I mean, I used to be an academic. I used to work in a lab. So, you know, I have a lot of fondness for academics. It's just, I think academics tend to assume, you know, they don't have the perhaps, you know, cutthroat business attitude, and they're assuming that their university wants the best for them. Best case scenario is it does, but like you've said, Jane, that cannot be taken for granted. We cannot assume the university is protecting the scientist's interest, it's protecting its own interest. And for example, in Poland, it's legally mandated to protect its own interest, and it will try to pressure the scientist into signing things that aren't the best possible option for them. So it's not just about looking and reading very carefully everything you sign. It's also making sure that you, by the time you get to signing a document, you have a team of people who support you. And that is something we put a lot of weight on. We make sure that we work with the best European patent attorneys. And it's also not enough that someone is a patent attorney or B, a European patent attorney. They have to specialize in particular fields of science. They have to know about electronics, they have to know about technology, they have to know about quantum physics. We've had cases of people working with European patent attorneys or who just didn't specialize in the right thing and didn't write up their patent in the right way. And that does not bode well for the future. You need to make sure that the people you work with know exactly what they're doing and are experienced. Particularly, quantum can be, you know, it's a little fidgety. It's kind of tricky stuff. There's a lot of smart minds who would have said it's very tricky even without the IP, you know, just the quantum itself is tricky, and then the IP comes in. So we really need to have the right team of people on our side, and please don't sign anything. I mean, like Jane said, in Poland, the situation, we've got a different legal system. Every European country has a different legal system. If you're a scientist in Sweden, you're golden, you know, Spain is, it's very different. Again, the US is different, but most cases in most European countries, even, you really do have to pay a lot of attention to the dealings with your university technology transfer center. Again, assume the best, prepare for the worst, and really make sure you do. That would be my, you know, piece of advice for the evening.
Thanks a lot. And maybe very quickly, just to conclude, for people who are trying to launch local initiatives, what would be your advice and feedback on how to get funded and sustain such local ecosystem to help academics or people turn into entrepreneurship in quantum? Maybe Maria, you can start.
I guess the best way we've seen of encouraging people to turn to entrepreneurship is by example. Again, not a particularly high-tech solution, but it really works if the person you met at the conference or the guy in the lab next door started a company or is talking about starting a company. And people get excited. I mean, I've worked with scientists who talk about their companies as an adventure, you know. I've literally heard people say, I could have a midlife crisis and buy a really expensive car. Oh, I can do this. And my wife doesn't want the car. so they'll go for the company. And I think the way to get people to think about entrepreneurship is to show them that it can be done. And we see a domino effect in the best, most positive sense of the word. We work with one scientist and we get them up and running, and we've set up their business, and 3 of their friends call within a week. And people talk, and I still think by example and people actually succeeding or learning from their failures and knowing what to do next is the best way to get people into entrepreneurship. I think the initiative Jane is part of, and giving people a lot of support is also incredibly important, because they do need this support. They really do. So both providing the support and teaching, or showing them that it's possible, leading by example, are what I would say are the possibly, in our experience, most successful means of doing this.
Thanks a lot. Jane?
No, I would definitely agree, because as I said, we managed to get 4 people come to the program in the first year. But ever since then, our numbers have increased, and our best recruiters are those 4 businesses that came through in year 1. Because of that 4, we got 4 businesses out the other end. So we had a 100% success rate. So we've used them as our recruiters, and it's exactly right. It's the network effect. They've talked to people, their friends, their people they're were doing their research with, and that has really helped our numbers increase. I think also it's the fact that seeing it being done successfully, and academics, I understand, are typically risk averse. And so the fact that we've had 4 successes in year 1 meant that people actually looked upon the entrepreneurship favorably. I think also one of the things that has helped is that we've recruited a team of mentors that have a give back attitude culture. So they actually give back their time for free. We don't pay them anything. And we've worked hard to get this team of people that are very, very encouraging. And it's just that network effect. It's almost a domino effect. But you asked about funding. And QTEC is, in fact, it's government funded, but it's only government funded until the 31st of March 2021. Yeah. So we're in the position now where we are looking to try and find a way that we can continue this work and can continue to be the UK program's commercialisation vehicle. So in terms of helping our businesses to raise money, we're pretty good at it. Doing it ourselves, we're not so good. Not at the moment, anyway. But I've got 5 projects running alongside each other, or 5 options that we will keep pursuing right up until that date.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. This will conclude the panel. Thanks a lot for all these insights. I hope that many people will try to copy and get in touch with you and start local initiatives, because it was very, yeah, you're really role models in Europe. So I hope that many people will copy what you do and adapt locally with local constraints. And now we'll have the pleasure to listen to Professor Michele MOSCA. I think he went through many of the different stages that we were speaking just before, as both academics and entrepreneur. Michele, I'm very happy to welcome you tonight. The floor is yours. You can share your presentation and start your keynote. Thanks a lot. And I think you're still on mute, Michele.
There we go.
Perfect. Thanks.
Merci, mes amis. It's a great pleasure to be here. Can you see my full screen of the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. It was great to hear the panel just before me. Great insights and great work, and keep up the great work. I'm going to sort of, in the next 25 minutes, just walk through my experiences in this space and try to share some insights and experiences that I hope are interesting and even useful to the audience. And thanks again for taking the time to listen. We're all, building or standing on the shoulders of giants. And one of the people, if I trace back my own experience is Bill Tutt, who was responsible for cracking the fish codes during the Second World War. And the reason I mention it partly is because, you know, Colossus, you may have seen the Imitation Games and saw that computer and so on. It was actually built to crack the fish codes. And, you know, the UK decided to keep it classified and dismantled it and never really developed an industry around that. And I'm not a historian of technology or economics, but I wonder if the UK regrets that and wishes it had, instead of keeping it a secret for, I mean, they must have good reasons for that. I'm not dismissing, they surely had good reasons for wanting to do that, but would it, in the long run, have been better for the UK to have tried to build an industry around that transformative technology? Now, Bill Tutt moved from England to Toronto to Waterloo. He was supervised Ron Mullen, who supervised Scott Vanstone, and they accidentally, this was super classified what he had done. So they didn't know he worked on cryptography. They just accidentally, serendipitously worked on the discrete logarithm problem, found a better algorithm that broke a technology that was already implemented in software and about to be implemented on chip. So then they caught the cryptography bug, and they ended up being my mentors, again, serendipitously, at Waterloo, and that got me interested in cryptography and cryptanalysis. And by another sort of serendipitous fluke, I ended up going to Oxford for graduate studies to work with Dominic Welsh, which is a wonderful choice. He's a wonderful, wonderful man and scholar. But I was going there to do cryptography and combinatorics. I'd seen quantum cryptography. I thought it was a joke. So I had this quantum stuff. I'd heard about quantum computing in '94 when I bumped into Don Coppersmith at a conference. I thought he was joking. I mean, I accidentally insulted him, you know, one of my heroes. So I did not go to Oxford to work in quantum computing. I'd vaguely heard of it and dismissed it. But Dominic said, you know, you might want to work on quantum algorithms. And and he even introduced me to Arthur Eckert, certainly, you know, a bright and an interesting and kind fellow. But I was really skeptical. Like, I really dismissed it. I went through the sort of the 3 stages that Schopenhauer outlined, you know, and then quite ironically, I realized I was wrong, and I said, this is going to work someday, and then went on to start an institute in this area. So it's a bit ironic. So at Oxford, I sort of entered the field at a very exciting time. It's very different times now, with all the young people we're now recruiting and teaching and mentoring. It's a very different era for them. So we just have to be cognizant of that. But very exciting time to do a lot of the early work in quantum algorithms and complex. We even did the first implementation of a quantum algorithm, which required sort of manually compiling the Deutsch algorithm to work on the available, you know, cycle that we had. So it was a very fun and exciting time. And a very hard decision for me to move back to Canada. So much going on at Oxford. We had this multidisciplinary group and so on. But I decided to go back and joined a cryptography group that was just being formed, sort of using the, you know, based on the legacy of cryptography that was there. And they supported me and encouraged me to start a quantum computing group. I guess they got more than they bargained for, because I really set out on this rogue effort to replicate, you know, sort of what I had at Oxford. And that group went, you know, much better than I could have ever imagined. And we founded the IQC in 2002, and the cryptography center is now sort of expanded into a broader cybersecurity and privacy institute. So it's, you know, it's a timeline of IQC, sort of a rogue effort initially. I was hoping in my wildest dreams to grow to 5 to 10 people from a grassroots effort. I also sort of learned about another rogue effort called the Perimeter Institute and decided to help them out. Again, these are all non-trivial decisions because, you know, at that stage of my career, I really should have been focusing on just writing as many papers as I could. I did write a lot of papers, but obviously this is a great drain on mind space at the time. But I thought it was the right decision in the long term for everyone. So we founded IQC in 2002, obviously with a great acceleration through another serendipitous event, whilst helping Perimeter Institute developed a relationship with Mike Lazaridis, who's very excited about what we were doing and helped us accelerate it to now one of the flagship centers for quantum computing. So, I mean, a recurring theme here just reminds me of Jim Collins' book, where he introduced the concept of return on luck. good versus great, great by choice. One of the disciplines he noticed correlated, with the this is related to companies, but I think it can also apply at a personal level, is just return on luck. So I think I definitely have encountered a lot of good luck, some bad luck, and I think I've tried over the years to try to make the best of whatever luck I was handed, even the bad things. So like I said, IQC, I think is reasonably well known nowadays. I mean, back then when I went there, I mean, Waterloo, people made jokes about, why are you moving to Belgium? But obviously Waterloo is very well known in its areas of expertise, including cryptography, computer science, and engineering. So IQC was set up, again, when it was a rogue effort, and I was hoping for a 5 to 10 person center. We'd have to be a bit strategic in terms of our focus. So I wanted it to be a connected group, interacting group, a great environment for our students and so on. But with 30 people, we can broaden our scope and deepen it. But it was always, the intention was always applications, foundations, and implementations. And we have, with application areas focused on computation, communication, sensing. And that went very well. I mean, it was a lot of work, obviously, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. But I think we have something to be proud of now. And there's a lot of that model has been replicated around the world now. About a decade into it, I started getting more, I always had that foot in the cryptography camp and the real world security camp. And I was getting worried that while, back in 1996 at Oxford, I was asked during my master's exam, when do you think we'll have a quantum computer, that can break RSA? And I said, look, not for 20 years, right? Zero chance of this happening in 20 years. But in 20 years, we'll have about 20 qubits, and then the path will be clear. Now, my 20-year probability went from 0 to 1% to 10% to now it's 80% or more, right? So about a decade ago, it was getting too close for comfort. So I really started focusing on, look, I'm very excited about all the wonderful opportunities of quantum computing, but we do have to mitigate the intrinsic risks. Fixing public, as we all know, quantum computers break public key cryptography. Our digital infrastructures rely directly or indirectly on these cryptographic tools and systems. And, back in the 90s, it wasn't nearly as big a deal as it would be today. Like now we depend on it much, much more than we did back in the 90s. So the point is, changing the cryptography is not a weekend job. It's not a one-year job. It's a 10 to 20-year job. So I get that the timeline for quantum computing, especially back a decade ago, is long, but fixing it is also a long trajectory. So, I developed this now famous equation of, if the collapse time is Z years and your migration time to quantum resistant crypto, quantum safe crypto is Y years, if your security shelf life is X years, for the next Y years using quantum vulnerable tools, you're supposed to provide those X years of security, confidentiality, or integrity, but if X plus Y is bigger than Z, you're not, right? So the question isn't, is there going to be a quantum computer here in the next year or two? The question is X plus Y bigger than Z? And the answer was increasingly becoming yes. Not for everybody, not even for most people, but for some very critical systems, critical assets, crown jewels. Even 10 years ago, I was worried we were getting into the X plus Y bigger than Z category. And that's only been exacerbated since then. Again, no need to panic, but we do need a disciplined approach. So I've been proselytizing and advocating and doing a lot of the fundamental research underlying this transition. Because unfortunately, the reality is just telling people there's a problem didn't motivate much action, right? And my colleague, Benoit Dupont, and his collaborators at the University of Montreal wrote a nice paper recently that kind of highlighted all the human obstacles I was seeing to just getting, logically, it was clear what needed to get done that would be good for society as a whole, but we weren't doing it. It's just logically, we should have been much better prepared for COVID-19. And I don't mean in some over-optimistic, some hindsight is 20/20 sense, but clearly the world did not follow even the most, some of the most basic advice to be better prepared for this. Again, not unrealistic. There were certainly things we could have done better. We wouldn't have avoided it, but we could have shaved off, I think, a factor of 10 in terms of human death and suffering and economic, the economic hit we're taking and will continue to take globally. I think we could have done an order of magnitude better by being proactive, yet we didn't. And there's all these human biases that they summed up so elegantly. But now is a special time, I think, in the world of cybersecurity. And now there's a visceral awareness of these biases and the very real impact they have on the world. So we have a chance to maybe move the needle before amnesia bias kicks in. So that's been a big part of my own work. Now, estimating Z is really hard. We don't know when there's a quantum computer, and that sort of justifies in many people's minds to do nothing, which is a big mistake, I think. And part of the equation is how big of a quantum computer do you need, right? And that depends on the many layers of the software of the stack, right? Is there a better algorithm for factoring? Can we synthesize it more efficiently? Are there better error correcting codes? Can we design better architectures with better error rates and so on? Any improvement anywhere in this stack would vastly reduce the resources needed to break public key cryptography, which of course shortens the timeline for Z. At the same time, of course, we need the hardware, but I see two curves: the downward sloping curve of how much quantum resources do we need, and the upward moving curve of what's available. And at some point, they're going to overlap. And we have to follow both curves, which is hard. Now, that's been, in the last decade especially, I focused a lot, 20, 25 years ago, I focused a lot on the algorithms, the complexity, and I still do work on that. But a decade ago, I thought the time it was right, at least for me, to start digging into what it takes to compile a quantum program to run on as few qubits as possible. And we developed a ton of unexpected, sometimes you just need to do it. Like, in theory, it should be fine. As Arthur Eckert once told me, in theory and practice are the same, but in practice, they're different. So just do it and see if it works, great. If it doesn't, you've discovered problems, right? And we discovered many challenges to efficiently implementing quantum circuits, and we developed and deployed very elegant mathematical tools for reducing the resources. And these are just some of them, including some very recent work. Now, and this just sort of takes me to my entrepreneurial experience. This is actually my second startup, but I'll get to the first startup shortly after. So again, over the years, I've been doing the work and training and teaching students and doing a lot of outreach. And we over and over again would get asked, can you help us with the next step? So it's been a lot of consulting on the side, but we have limited time. So I always tried to keep that at a manageable amount. But things started to heat up, and we ended up, sort of packaging all this great talent, intellectual property that we had, and turn it into a business led by Dr. Vlad Georgiou. And, when I think of him, I also think of the other Jim Collins, sort of advice in terms of get the right people on the bus. So it's great to work with Vlad. And, in the initial stages, and this is also chasm in the Geoffrey Moore sense, you really have to understand your customer and their needs and cater to those and sort of vertically integrate a solution for them. So our main focus initially is on the consulting and professional services side, proof of concepts, helping them understand and find useful applications. And one of the interesting things we've done is package a lot of the fundamental tools we developed into a stack that is sort of easy to use, very lean and mean, and it's open. People are free to use it. And we think it's important we still have to build the market, right? We still have to create a very healthy ecosystem. Let's build a big pie, and let's of course have a share of the pie after. But I think at this stage in the industry, we really need to focus on working together to build a big opportunity for all of us. So these are just examples of some of the tools that were implemented alongside the Quantum++ simulator that Vlad implemented and is being adopted around the world. So these are great tools to help people prepare for the quantum era. And one of the applications of these tools, now these papers are written before STACK, so we more manually integrated the optimization tools, helps us answer how big of a quantum computer do we need. So we've done estimates, when we keep updating these estimates for breaking symmetric key cryptography, like SHA and AES, as well as public key cryptography, like RSA and ECC. And guess what? The resource requirements keep going down. In the last 4 to 5 years, they've gone down by about 4 orders of magnitude, which is a non-trivial deal. This is sort of space-time volume sort of a metric. So we continue this work, and our tools help reduce our understanding of what the actual requirements are to be cryptographically relevant. Of course, they also help us reduce the requirements to be useful for drug design and all these other positive applications. So the what is Z question, we still don't know. But like I said, my estimates went from 0% to 80%. And now that's one tail, which really doesn't matter as much. What matters for cybersecurity is the tail on this side, which is, what's the chance that it happens sooner rather than later? I think there's a 20% chance that it's in less than 10 years. You can also go to that link at the bottom where we surveyed 22 thought leaders. You got their opinions, and we produce a nice histogram. And you get a sense of what are sort of typical opinions. And there's a spectrum, of course, but nobody we interviewed thought it was very unlikely to happen in 20 or 30 years, right? That there's no I think sound reason to be super confident it's going to take a long time. And my opinions are roughly middle of the pack. Now, this is not a doom and gloom scenario, because we actually know how to fix it, but we just have to proactively go out and do it. The obvious thing, of course, is to replace post-quantum public key cryptography with these post-quantum alternatives. This is great because you don't need quantum hardware, but quantum cryptography allows us to supplement this tool suite. And I think that's a very valuable thing. Again, when I first heard of quantum crypto, I thought it was a joke. I went through all the usual stages, but I firmly believe that it's an important and valuable addition to the cryptographic ecosystem. And together they allow us to get security properties and security levels we can't do with just one or the other. And QKD, this is a classic challenge of getting a disruptive technology taken seriously. And I see a lot of the thinking is really focused on where the puck is now and where it's going, right? The fact is, physicists are going to build a quantum internet because it's at the cutting edge of science and technology. And the security people, like when a company's deciding should we use cloud, they're not being asked to build the cloud. Their question is, do we use the cloud? And you should, of course, if you're anticipating the cloud coming, you should position yourself for that eventual transition or potential transition. So I think with QKD, the technology is going to improve. The price points are going to go down. It's going to become easier and easier to integrate QKD into your platforms. Not easy, but easier. So I think we need to aim with that in mind. And I also think the timing is critical. We can't just sit back, relax, build the quantum internet, and when it's available, see how it can make our systems more secure, because it'll be very hard to wedge these new tools back in. It's hard to make something that isn't broken better, until there's a catastrophe. But the kinds of risks QKD help mitigate are not the kinds of risks you want to learn from the hard way. So now's a critical time as post-quantum cryptography is about to be standardized and deployed. We really need to design QKD or agility, the ability to use QKD into our architectures. And our approach for both of my companies has not been, let's build a product and then try to, sell it to people who have no clue why they would ever need it, right? I think it was premature. I'm not against, I applaud people who are building products, and I've seen viscerally how hard it's been for them to sell the products that were ahead of their time. So our approach has been, especially with cryptography, just take a risk management approach. And that's why we started with services, developed the quantum risk assessment methodology, let people understand for themselves what their migration timelines should be, and then let them come back to us as a community and us as a company to help meet those challenges, right? And then you can start charging the rates that Maria was talking about. Because right now you can't charge $1,000 an hour, whatever you want to charge for somebody who doesn't want you for free, right? So in the beginning, very pre-chasm, it's a hard thing. So maybe we shouldn't, maybe this, our strategy, my strategy has been, let's create the awareness, the market, let people come to that conclusion, help them get there, and then there'll be a pull for these kinds of solutions. Like I said earlier, it's hard. This is not an easy transition. Getting standards deployed and validation regimes and audits and so on set up. It takes many, many years to do properly. So another initiative I took was to really convene the international community in this space to discuss where we need to go in terms of standardization and anything related to that, and what can we do together to get there. And we've made a lot of progress since we started this workshop 7-8 years ago. There is the NIST timeline, again, which is probably a decade in the making, and we're going to see an inflection point in quantum safe cybersecurity. When the NIST standards come out, all the people who are saying, well, I can't do anything, there's no standard, which is largely an excuse, they'll either have to do something or come up with a new excuse. And furthermore, as many people start actually doing something, it'll be harder, the laggards will start to stick out a bit more. So I think that that'll be a very important inflection point for the field. There's other inflection points like the achievement, when we eventually achieve a fault-tolerant qubit and so on, which will further accelerate. I do want to flag that we do need, as researchers, to keep working on cryptanalysis even beyond the NIST standardization. It's absolutely critical. Other things that I've helped initiate to help give us the tools and the ability to prepare for the quantum era is an open source platform for post-quantum cryptography. I once talked about 7-8 years ago, I talked to a startup who realized, we don't want, it was a secure file sharing company. They didn't want those files to be for sale on the dark web when quantum computers are here, right? Or they didn't want that possibility to be on the minds of their customers. So he asked me, what do I do? And I realized, well, nothing, right? There's nothing you can do because you have a company of 5 people. You don't want to be writing your own crypto. You don't write your own crypto today. You probably use OpenSSL or use it as a reference or some proprietary implementations. What do you do? And I thought, let's set up the OpenSSL of post-quantum crypto, which we've done, and it's going very well. And we have buy-in, people from France have helped, Amazon, Microsoft, EvolutionQ, and so on. It's a great sort of experimental framework, but also a test framework for industry. This sort of is a look under the hood of the framework. We've also studied and posted white papers on, we don't have to just protect current systems. We want to make sure that new systems we're deploying aren't dead on arrival when quantum computers come here. They, at the very least, have to have a roadmap to quantum resilience. When they deploy the quantum safe tools, that's a tactical decision, but you better have it on your long-term roadmap. So we wrote a white paper articulating the issues for blockchains, for example. QKD, it's been a struggle to be taken seriously, and I think part of the struggle has been, going from a hardware and photons and lasers to my IT architectures. There's a few layers in there that make it hard for people to even understand, well, how this really look in the real world. They don't want to deal with the hardware layer typically. Like when you go to cloud, you're not usually bothering with all the hardware infrastructure, right? There's several layers of abstraction before you really touch the metal. So we, and this is following frameworks defined by, SecOQC and others. It's in a similar spirit. We articulated sort of a 4-layer architecture with clean, open interfaces. We want these to be open. We want, people to compete on high quality implementations of all the layers. And that will create a market. If this stack was encumbered with IP and it was like, it was vendor lock-in, like basically it'd be a race to the bottom. Let me get 100% of a market of size 0 is what that would be. I think the smart bet, and that's what we've been advocating, and I think essentially everyone in the field, or most people in the field, let's agree on the interfaces and let's compete on the quality of our implementations of the various pieces. And so we designed this framework. Again, it's pretty analogous, or these are kind of obvious in a sense. These are natural layerings, and we're working with colleagues around the world to standardize interfaces, either standardize what we proposed or change what our framework to be consistent with the standards. It's not a big deal as long as it's simple, designed with value for the end customer in mind, and that helps create a big market for all our innovative tools. And we also produce an open source version of this to make it easier for people, because most people are working in one piece of this stack. It's not easy. We don't need 100 independent poor implementations of the other pieces, right? If you want to do proof of concept, here's a prototype of the full stack. You can now demonstrate how great your new innovation improves the full stack. So we have an open source implementation with the idea of it being sort of a reference implementation and also a way to do proofs of concept. Now, so we've done a lot, myself, my colleagues at Waterloo and around the world to make it possible, to make it better, easier, to be ready for the quantum era. It's still a challenge because people still, even with all the tools, not all, but many of the tools are available, they're not sure where to start. Like, what do I actually do? What do I buy today? Especially if in some cases like QKD or quantum computing, they're not here yet. So why do I do why should I just do nothing until it is here? And I think I'd go back to, this is, the chair of the board of RBC said this at a dinner a few months ago. Success is 10% strategy, 90% execution. Well, execution is 90% planning and 10% doing. So we need to prepare for this era in parallel. We don't, with all the hard work to build some of these platforms. Because especially for quantum safe cybersecurity, but also for quantum applications, quantum software and so on, if your sector is being disrupted by quantum enhanced computation, you don't want to be in the catch-up game because there might be no more jobs in your company or in your sector, in your jurisdiction, if you didn't see this coming. So the planning, which is, in generally speaking, the cheap part of the equation, is really important to do in advance because you don't get to call a timeout when you realize, whoops, this is for real. I should have started 2 years ago. My competitors have. You don't get to call timeout and get ready. And so EvolutionQ was born out of Norbert Lutkenhaus and I, as well as David Zhao, who joined us as chief cryptographer. We've been doing consulting and industry work in this space for a long time, but it was heating up about 5, 6, 7 years ago. CIO of Canada asked us about proof of concept and so on and so on. And we realized like 90% of the work that needs to get done with industry doesn't require a professor, right? It requires a different skill set complementary to what we do. And so we started a company and we've been doing the consulting and proofs of concept and quantum risk assessments, obviously with input from ourselves, but we in some sense, we're scaling those days that, all that time that we're putting in, we're getting a 10x multiplier because now we have this great team around us. Again, following that Jeffrey Moore, we're still on this side of the chasm. So that's why we started with a lot of education and awareness and risk assessments and so on. But we understand the real product pain points. I am seeing a phase transition. I think we are approaching various inflection points. So I think it is a good time to increasingly get into the product space. Now I guess the policies and practices are starting to change. We're still in the early days of it, but I think there's a greater receptiveness to product. Not that the floodgates have opened. We're not in the tornado, but we're starting to see, as my one friend once said when I said, how's the PhD thesis going? He said, I can see the tunnel. So I think we can see the tunnel. We can even see the light at the end of the tunnel, but we're not at the end of the tunnel yet. So these are sort of roughly the three technical pillars of our company. Research, I don't mean university research. This is sort of targeted industry research to help us understand the sector, help others in the ecosystem understand what they need to understand. Assessments and roadmaps, upgrade strategies, and increasingly products. And just before I wrap up, this is sort of my attempt at expressing in business terms why we need to be proactive. Again, COVID-19, I think, has created, at least subconsciously, a more visceral appreciation of, pure short-termism is bad, right? Of course, you have to survive in the short term, but I think we should aim to thrive in the longer term. And so it's, the problem with short-termism is in the short term, doing nothing is just a little bit more easy than being proactive. In the long term, it's clear what's the better track. And with quantum safe cryptography, there's two things that are different. this, because you could plug in almost anything here where it's going to be disruptive and you want to be proactive or reactive. I kind of fine-grained it for quantum safe cryptography. With quantum safe crypto, there's also a bit of a moral hazard for the reactive people, because, you know, they're going to take a chance. Worst case, you know, we go down, but it's almost like a too big to fail mentality. They're going to take a lot of the ecosystem down with them. As we saw, for example, with the subprime mortgages, you know, the people who sold the subprime mortgages, they did okay, actually, but the whole economy suffered. So there's a moral hazard there that we need to be aware of. But I think with quantum safe cryptography, the proactive approach not only makes us more resilient to quantum attacks, but all the disciplines we need to defend against quantum attacks will help us be more resilient to other unknown unknowns of the future. As Tahir Al-Gamal once told me, because he's like, I don't know if I'm convinced by your quantum stuff, but I like what you're doing because you've made a strong business case for cryptographic agility, which is something he really believes in and thinks is important for sort of the resilience of our digital infrastructures, which I also believe in. And so what we're doing, quantum readiness, actually, if we're proactive, makes us more resilient to other unknown unknowns. And reactiveness, a crisis, will actually make it worse. So it's really a fork in the road. You know, one path makes us stronger than we otherwise would be. The other path makes us weaker than we otherwise would be. Because a very rushed patch to our cryptographic foundation will make an already vulnerable system even worse. So I'd like to end there and leave time for any questions.
Thanks a lot, Michele, for this very clear and interesting presentation, especially in terms of practical implementation of cryptography. I can only hope that decision makers will listen to you and follow you. Unfortunately, we're a bit after schedule, so questions can be asked through the Q&A, and don't hesitate to ask a question to Michele through the Q&A. And Michele, I hope you can answer all the questions writtenly through the Q&A window. And thanks again. It was very clear and very interesting presentation. And now I'd like to give the floor to Itamar. Itamar, thanks a lot for joining us tonight, especially given the context. Congratulations again. The floor is yours. Maybe Michele, if you can stop sharing your screen so that Itamar can share his. Thanks a lot, Michele.
Okay, great. Yes. So first of all, Robert, it's a pleasure to join the Lab Quantique session and to share our point of view on quantum computing in general and about what we do in the quantum orchestration platform in particular. Let me share my presentation and we'll take it from there. Great. Robert, can you confirm that you can see my slide?
Perfect. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Quantum orchestration. So what are we trying to do? We are trying to make quantum computers solve hard and useful problems. What does that mean? Hard problems means problems which are way too difficult for classical computers as we know them, and useful means problems that someone is going to be willing to pay for the solution. And we're seeking to solve problems in the intersection of both. Now, it is widely established that quantum computers can disrupt pretty much any market or any industry. And that is not because anyone, I guess, went market by market and checked whether quantum computer can indeed disrupt it, but rather because there is a very long list of subroutines or algorithmics such as machine learning and optimization problems, that we believe that quantum computers can run far, far faster. So that means that any industry relying on these can eventually benefit from quantum computing. Now, today, I'm not going to talk about this opportunity, but rather I'm going to talk about the road ahead towards realizing this potential and what are the challenges in this road. Before that, I'd just like to briefly introduce some of the team at QM. QM has a team of brilliant quantum physicists, which have devoted many years for research on pretty much any quantum platform under the sky, including the founding team of QM that I'm part of, but also many of our core quantum team are. So we have people that spent years on superconducting qubits and trapped ions and atomic clocks and quantum dots and NV centers and carbon nanotubes and so on and so forth. So really a very diverse quantum team. I'll just make a small note on everyone is brilliant in the team. I'll just make a small note about Nissim here that you see, Nissim Ofik that you see here. So Nissim was in fact the first person worldwide to demonstrate quantum error correction. So he did that experimentally, yeah, during his postdoc at Yale University. If anyone is interested, I can direct you to the Nature paper. So we're also working with a great scientific advisory board and investors. I can note a couple of people here, for example, Amelia Jacobi from Harvard University, a leading scientist in quantum dots, silicon qubits, NV centers, and so on. And Avigdor Vilens, who is one of QM's investors. Avigdor himself founded and led some of the most prominent hardware startups of the recent years. He founded and led Annapurna Labs, which was acquired by Amazon and became basically the first hardware division of the cloud quantum computing in Amazon, so quite a significant company. He also founded and managed Habana Labs. Habana Labs was recently acquired by Intel and now becoming the leading AI chips division in Intel, based in Israel. So we really have a great honor to work with amazing people. So what we develop at QM, I hope you can see the video. If you cannot, then not big deal. What we develop at QM is the quantum orchestration platform. So the quantum orchestration platform is a first of its kind platform that allows to realize the potential of any quantum processor It is a whole new approach to controlling and operating quantum processors that allows users to run even the most complex quantum algorithms, from quantum error correction to quantum machine learning, seamlessly with code, with software, therefore not needing to develop any classical hardware to run it. Now, before I deep dive into what it is exactly, I'd like to take a few steps backwards and answer, partly at least, a big question, which is, why don't we have full-scale quantum computers yet? Now, of course, there are many, many answers to this question, but the majority of the answers to this question resort to the qubit. So I'm pretty sure most of the audience of the Lab Quantique is familiar with the qubit, right? The qubit is basically the this magic fundamental building block of the quantum computer. This is this component that can be both 0 and 1 at the same time. Normally, after we glorify the qubit for giving us access to, at least theoretically, an immense computational power, what we start doing is saying very bad things at it. What we typically say is that it's very susceptible to noise, it rapidly loses coherence, it has a very short lifetime, and so on and so forth. Now, all of these eventually boil down to very few parameters, which, if you wish, in words, these are the quality and the quantity of qubits that you are capable of packing into a quantum processor. And the question that I'd like to ask today is whether this is the end of the story. And of course, the answer is no, this is not the end of the story at all. Quality and quantity is not the end of the story. Quality and quantity of the qubits in your quantum processor. And I'll rephrase it. For example, let's say you have today a quantum processor with 160 qubits, or maybe even 16 qubits, or maybe even 6, okay? Can you today, with all the technology that we have developed thus far, realize the potential of such a quantum processor? And the answer is, in fact, no, not at all, in fact, okay? And it stems from the following thing, which we like to illustrate with an analogy. Okay, and of course I shall explain. You may know that in order to merely describe the information contained in a quantum processor with 300 qubits, quantum bits, you would need more classical transistors in your classical processor than the number of atoms in the universe. Okay, 300 qubits, in order to merely describe the information in them, stored in them, you would need more classical transistors than the number of atoms in the universe. Okay, and this stems from something very, very fundamental, and that is that the complexity of quantum systems scales exponentially with the number of units in the quantum system. And that is not the case for classical systems, which on the other hand need to control and operate these quantum systems. And the conclusion here is that operating and controlling QPUs is fundamentally challenging. And the reason why we decided that there has to be an entire company which is focused on that challenge. And that's what we do. And I'm going to break this down for you to explain this challenge very technically, even if you don't have a very technical background. So in order to do that, we'll have to cover briefly how a classical computer works. Let's take a deep dive into that. A classical computer, is probably all of you know, is based on bits. Bits are the fundamental building blocks of a classical computer, and the bits are units that can be either 0 or 1. Okay, one bit can be either 0 or 1. Okay, now if you have, for example, n bits, okay, n bits, n is the favorite number for physicists, then these bits can be in different binary combinations, namely combinations of zeros and ones. Let's take an example. They can all be zeros, or alternatively, they can all be ones. Or for example, they can be the first half of the bits are zeros, and the second half, the other half, is all ones. Okay, but the thing is that they must be in one combination at every single point of time. Okay, and that's the tricky part. Now, what's the consequences for algorithmics on classical computers? How does an algorithm conceptually run on a classical computer? Let's cover that. So let's say, for example, that you have your classical computer with n bits, okay? But before you start running the algorithm, you need to initialize the processor. So for example, you see here, we have all of these black dots, and there is one which is red, okay, or pink. The binary combination to its left is the binary combination that we start with. So the first bit is 0, the second bit is 1, and all the rest are zeros. We start off with this combination, okay? Now, then you may know that your processor has a clock, okay? And at every tick of the clock, basically what the processor does is goes from one binary combination to the next, and to the next, and so on and so forth, until you get a final binary combination, okay? And that is the result. The binary combination represents your result. This is conceptually how a classical computer works, okay? It's pretty simple. Now, how does a quantum computer works? So a quantum computer, you know by now, is based on the qubit. The qubit differs from the bit, in the fact that it can be both 0 and 1 at the same time. Okay. Now, if you have n qubits, these n qubits can also be in all of the different binary combinations. Okay, so they can all be zeros, they can all be ones, they can be half zeros, half ones, they can be half ones, the first half ones, the second half zeros, and so on and so forth. But the thing here, the substantial thing here, is that in fact they can also be in all of these combinations at every single point of time, or in fact they can be in any combination of combinations. Okay, now what's the consequence here on running algorithms on a quantum computer? So the quantum computer is also initialized. So we have, once again, we have n bits, and they are initialized. Here we initialized it to be 2 qubits. The first qubits are 0. The third one is 1, and all the rest are zeros. This is just, it can be any other. But then, before going to the next step, what you do is you remember, wait a minute, this is a quantum computer, right? So if this is a quantum computer, I'm not limited to being in only one binary combination. In fact, I can go from being in this binary combination to going to maybe 4 others. And from each one of those, I can continue to a few more, and so on and so forth. And the thing here is that the ability to go through in parallel, to go in parallel through multiple paths, which we call computational paths, is what gives quantum computers the power to run some algorithmics far faster. This is what we leverage, okay? The ability to be in multiple binary combinations at every single point of time, and through that to scan the entire path space simultaneously. Okay, now of course, in order to fully nail this down, we'd have to talk about how to measure this result and interference and so on and so forth. Maybe some of you are familiar with these terms, but fundamentally, this is what we leverage in order to boost quantum computer computation with quantum computers compared to the poor classical counterparts. Now, how does it look in practice? Okay, this was very conceptual. We'll now take it one level. We'll go one level down to understand this in practice. Now, there is another very important concept in classical computers, which is the gates, logic gates. Gates take bits as input, the bits that we have discussed, and they give bits as output. Okay, so for example, you see here we illustrated it with at the bottom left, they take a particular binary combination and they output another. Okay, a particular logic gate will output another binary combination. So let's give an example. An example of that would be a multiplier. A multiplier is a logic operation that takes as input 2 and 3, for example, and would give you as an output 6. Okay, and of course the 2 and 3 would have to be represented with bits. This is very technical, but the fundamental thing here is that we have logic operations like the multiplier that gets data as an input and gives data as output. And we can generally say that the entire classical processor is packed with logic operations and logic gates, which are physically embedded into the classical processor. What does it mean that it is physically embedded into the classical processor? It means that the classical processor that is in your laptop that you're using right now, yes, once it came out of the the Intel fab, yeah, it already had much of the logic operations that it will run, okay, from the multiplier and all the way to a neural network. Okay, it's embedded inside physically. Okay, so it means that you can think of it as if the classical processor, it has lots of logic inside. It gets data as input and it gives data as output. Okay, this is a very fundamental thing to understand about classical computers. And why am I saying such fundamental things about classical computers, which may be even obvious to some of you? I'm saying all of that because quantum computers in fact, work very, very differently. And that's the big surprise. Quantum computers have quantum processors, which once again are composed of quantum bits. But the thing is that the quantum processor does not contain logic operations inside as its classical counterpart did. Okay, it contains mostly quantum data, which is again exponential in the number of quantum bits there are inside. Okay, so you can think of it as a massive storage of data. But then, of course, it is a processor. It needs to process, right? It needs to process the data. So and processing means logic operations, like the multiplier and so on and so forth. So where are the logic operations of this quantum processor? And the big surprise is that the logic gates or the logic operations are sent to the quantum processor, okay, via pulses. Typically, these would be electromagnetic pulses, like microwave or laser pulses, and so on and so forth. So that every pulse that you send to the quantum processor will encode a logic operation. So you can think of it as if you can encode a multiplier into the pulse, and then you send it, okay? And then the next question is, of course, who is sending all of these pulses? Who's responsible for running the logic on the quantum processor? And the big surprise here is that this is a classical processor that does that. And that takes us back to one of the main messages of this presentation, that we're using classical systems which are exponentially less complex, okay, than the quantum processors to control and operate them, making this challenge immense. In fact, in some regards, almost impossible, okay? So indeed, operating and controlling QPUs is fundamentally challenging, and the reason why we chose to focus on this layer exactly. Now, this understanding that I hope you gained now will allow us to go farther and understand the stack of the entire quantum computer. So you see, primarily, the quantum computer has 3 layers. Okay, it has the quantum hardware, the classical hardware that controls and operates it, and the software above. The quantum hardware primarily includes the quantum processor. This is, of course, the heart of the quantum computer. And it also includes some other components like quantum compatible electronics, cables, amplifiers, and so on and so forth. Then the classical hardware primarily includes what we call the quantum controllers, RF electronics, lasers, and so on and so forth. In between, what you have is pulses, as we explained earlier. Above that, you have the software stack, which is, of course, very complex and multi-layer by itself. But we could say that some of the main components there are, of course, quantum algorithms and applications, quantum programming languages. And in between, you have compilers. Now, another important note here is that, as you understand by now, the third, like the lowest layer here, so the quantum hardware, is far, far more complex than the 2 above, the classical hardware and the software. Okay, just for the fundamental reason that we explained, that the complexity of quantum systems scales exponentially with the number of units. And therefore, one of the consequences is that, and we're seeing that, and we're doing that as well at QM, is that we need lots of supercomputing resources backing the classical stack in order to actually run complex algorithmics on quantum processors. And this supercomputing resources is devoted to a great deal of things. I'll mention just a few of them. So things like results verification, very challenging, algorithm optimization, pulse optimization, system calibrations, and so on and so forth. Now, this will now allow me to frame for you the quantum orchestration platform and what exactly it is that we do in the quantum stack. So the first thing, the transition to the next slide, might be a little bit difficult. So the first thing you need to remember, keep this in mind, and remember that I've just taken this from being vertical to being horizontal, okay? So the quantum orchestration platform is aimed at allowing users to run even the most advanced quantum algorithms out of the box, namely with no effort and from a high-level programming language, QA. Let's break this down. So you see, first of all, on the right, you see this is the quantum hardware. In the middle, you have the classical hardware, and on the left, you have the software. Now, at the heart of our quantum orchestration platform, there is the dedicated hardware that we have developed at QM, at the heart of which there is the processor, the classical processor that we have developed, the pulse processor. Now, the pulse processor is capable of itself, its architecture was developed in order to allow running even the most complex quantum algorithms, as I mentioned earlier. Now, what does that mean to run even the most complex quantum algorithm? So let me just tell you what is a quantum algorithm from a practical perspective. A quantum algorithm is in fact composed of 4 things, okay, which are gates. This is what we mentioned earlier in the form of pulses. It also includes measurements, okay, because we need, from time to time, we need to measure what's going on in the quantum processor. This is also done with pulses, typically. It also includes a great deal of classical processing. So we note here Turing complete to say that our hardware is very, very general, but the classical processing can be extremely heavy. So, and it can also include what we said earlier as the supercomputing resources. The fourth part is control flow. So control flow is a very technical term, which basically means for those of you who have done some programming, you know, all the if else, for loops, while loops, cases, and so on and so forth. Now, if you take all of these 4 together, you basically, in all of the combinations between them, form the variety of quantum algorithms that you may want to run. Okay. Now, in a physicist's language, we always like to say that the 4 of these, they span a space. This is just a notation. They span a space of algorithms which the pulse processor can in fact digest and run. Okay. Now, the idea here is that the pulse processor can run even the most complex quantum algorithms, as we said, with no effort. That means that you don't need to work hard on developing any hardware, any classical hardware. But what you get, what we offer our users and customers is a programming language, a very intuitive programming language, which we call QA, which is aimed at being a standard quantum computing programming language. And what you do is you program your quantum algorithm in QA, then your quantum algorithm is compiled through our proprietary compiler to the assembly, the machine language of the pulse processor, which will then get your algorithm in its assembly and run it in real time in the most efficient way possible. And the last point here is, as you will see now on the right, is that this system is aimed at being qubit agnostic, okay? Namely, to control pretty much any quantum any quantum system, any quantum processor out there. So, by the way, and this is an important note, it's not limited to quantum processors, but it can also be quantum sensors and so on and so forth. Now, quantum computing is today no longer science fiction, thanks to the immense efforts of brilliant people across universities and companies worldwide. Some players are mentioned here, mostly non-academic ones. But one of the final notes here is that while it is no longer science fiction, it is also not yet a reality. Okay. Now, for that, we have developed the quantum orchestration platform, which is by now deployed for multiple teams worldwide including some of the leading compute multinationals involved in the field, quantum startups, national labs, academic institutions, and so on and so forth. We have today customers in about 8 countries, which work on pretty much any quantum platform for quantum computers out there. So of course, the majority is superconducting qubits, and then trapped ions and atoms and NV centers as well, and cold and quantum dots, and even a topological quantum bits for topological quantum computing. So with that, I'd like to thank you all and encourage you, those of you who haven't yet joined the quantum arena, to indeed join us to indeed make this a reality and realize the potential of quantum computers. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Itamar. It was a very nice presentation, very pragmatic. Thanks a lot for explaining the difference between classical and quantum computing. I think it helps a lot. And it reminds me of a former session where one of the major issues that was stressed is the fact that people will need to understand how calculations are performed. Thanks to you, I think that a lot of people now understand the difference. So it was very great and very clear. And I wish you the best of luck in your new adventure and new adventures, actually. So thanks a lot for sharing all these insights and feedback today with us. That's it for today. Once again, I'd like to thank warmly all panelists and all speakers today for their great feedback, great presentations. I hope that, but I'm quite sure that all attendees are very happy with that. We'll have a break for summer. So the next meeting, next webinar will be after summer. And again, thanks a lot for all these feedbacks, for this great presentation, and looking forward to meeting you all in September or October. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. J'ai arrêté l'enregistrement. Je suis en train d'arrêter la diffusion.